is up, guys? I'm back in the States, and as much fun as I had in Japan, I really need to get back to work on this thing because I need to get on the ground and rolling, and I will explain why later in this video. And also, I got good news. I found my rack mounting brackets. I guess since I have these in hand, we'll start off with the rack. To recap real quick, since this Mark II is right-hand drive, this S13 rack is from a 180SX because 180SXs are right-hand drive. And we're going to use these Part Shop Max rack bushings to hold it in place. I confirmed that the joint doesn't reach the steering column and the splines on the rack all the way. Right now on the rack side, it's being held on by ½ inch and it still has another, I would say like 3/4 left to go. And the steering column doesn't have any room to go inside. Luckily, I checked before I left to Japan and I ordered this extension piece from Part Shop Max. So it does hit the downpipe, but not a lot. So what I'm gonna do to gain a little bit of clearance is heat this area up and then hammer it out. And hopefully that's enough space for the joint to be able to turn. I know it doesn't look like it clears in video, but it clears. When you turn it, it no longer hits the downpipe, but I'm gonna take it off and hammer it out a little bit more. Just because when you do floor it, the engine does turn a little bit to the side and I don't want that movement to hit the joint. Now we're moving on to the lines, and this is a high pressure hose. This side will be going onto the rack, and then this fitting will be going onto the power steering pump. I got this on Suspicious Garage's website, and this is specifically made for a S13 that is right-hand drive with a JZ in it. And for the low pressure side, I bought this 180-degree -6 fitting that will go on like this, and I'll have the line route alongside the rack and then come up here and back into the reservoir. The reservoir is really dirty, so I'm going to clean it up before I put it back in. The line is actually way too long. I tried looking online on their website to see if I maybe placed it wrong, but their website doesn't have any helpful photos. So what I ended up doing is routing it up here, but I honestly don't like it. It's adding to the mess of hoses right here. But I'll get a shorter one later down the road. That way I can hide it down there, and that way it doesn't add to this mess of hoses right here. I'm honestly kind of disappointed in this one. I don't think they really took the length into consideration and kind of just guessed. But I got the reservoir cleaned up. I still will put a sock on it because it's dingy and it's yellow, and right now I don't want to spend the money on a reservoir if I don't need it. But on top of not buying a baffled aftermarket reservoir, I'm also not putting it in a cooler or a filter because I honestly don't know how well this reservoir does. I know on Nissans, the stock Nissan 241s, they're not that great, and that one I've always had problems with fluid boiling over and spilling out. But I got a Chase Bay ones and that kind of fixed the issue. But I don't know if I'll have that same problem with this car and with that reservoir. But right now I'm kind of on a tight budget, so I'm gonna keep this one for now and see if it works. And yes, I know my engine bay is filthy. The car has been sitting for months. I will get to washing it once the car is on the floor and running. But I got the hose that goes to the pump on. And then this one goes to the low pressure side of the rack. I just need to put a hose clamp on here. And both of them are routed alongside the rack, but I made a mistake. I put them in between the hard lines, so if I ever needed to take off the rack, I would need to take off the hoses as well, so I gotta change it out. I also don't like how far the high pressure line sticks out. If this becomes a problem, I think I might just buy a 90 right here. That way I can 90 it this way, and that way it can hug closer a little bit to the rack, and that way it's not sticking out as much as it is right now. Like, you could see how much more compact a 180-degree fitting is versus just a 90. And yes, I did mark my low and high pressure sides because I always forget which is which. The power steering side of things is done, so I'm going to fill up the reservoir so I can check for leaks and I can get started on bleeding the system. I'm not going to show the bleeding procedure because I already have a video on that. If you want to know how to properly bleed a power steering system, go ahead and check that out. Now moving on to the tension rod and the bracket. Now this is going to be the hardest part of the install because this is the only thing that's not bolt on, because these holes were never meant to line up with the X8 chassis and frame rails. So we got to figure out how we can get this as identical in measurements from an S13. So I jacked up my 240 and I measured from the center of the lower control arm to the first bolt hole. And I also took measurements from a stock lower control arm and measured it from this bolt to this bolt hole right here to kind of get this in a stock location. And I noticed it's almost exactly where the tension rod needs to be. The second hole doesn't line up all the way, but we got to figure out if we need to shave this hole or move this bracket forward or backwards. I wedged up the bracket to the first bolt hole. Yes, this will need to be drilled out a bit. Okay, so I bolted up the tension rod on the lower control arm and I bolted up the bracket to the heim joint over here, and I realized that it needs to come outward a lot. So I think I'm gonna be shaving this hole after all. This hole will need to be drilled out a little bit also to get the bolt to fit, because that hole is off center from this hole. But for now, I wanted to see if the tension rod would fit, and the first hole actually does line up. But my dumb ass overshot where the second bolt hole was supposed to be. So now I gotta cut this off right here, and hopefully it doesn't weaken the arm too much because I got plenty of holes right here. And I also have to remove a little bit of material on the bottom so I can get the nut to fit. But yeah, measure once, cut twice. Alright, it's not pretty, but the bolts go in now. I didn't think I have to be cutting into the lower control arm at all, but I didn't want to have to compensate either pulling this one way or the other, because I want this to float as freely and as factory straight as possible. But now that we got this figured out, I can move on to the tension rod bracket, and I'm gonna remove the bracket and measure the factory holes from here to here and get a hole drilled out. That way I can have this side on the frame rail fully mounted. Alright, so I got the second bolt put in. I took this off and I measured from hole to hole and drilled it out, and this is the hole that would be used if this was going on an S13, but I used the X8 frame rail holes, and now this thing is super sturdy. And also I'm going to be cutting or figuring out where I need to cut right here so I can put a bolt straight through. Holes are drilled out. Next, we got the tie rods. And putting them on is really easy. You just thread it into the rack. And then you just tighten that up. You can add Loctite if you want. I never do, but the problem sometimes with some tie rods is you need a really big wrench or a crescent wrench to get in here. And if somehow you're trying to remove it and it gets really stuck and a crescent wrench won't do it, a pipe wrench will do the job. Just grab it on from here and you have way more grip strength to get that thing removed. These things are very handy and should be in everybody's toolbox. And before you put on your outer tie rod, make sure that you put on your boot, because then you're not going to be able to shove it in there. What did he say? And I cut mine open a little bit because these PBM tie rods do have a little bit of girth to them. But now they can go in. This was the part that was having the most problem before I cut it, and now it goes in and out no problem. Put a zip tie on the rack and you're done. When putting on the outer tie rods, make sure that you put your lock nut first. And I'm going to be reusing the P2M outer tie rods that I bought for the 240, but ended up not working out. This car isn't as low as a 240, so I shouldn't have any problem with the articulation on the joint. In my intro video, I mentioned that I had S13 calipers and I still needed to get S13 rotors and pads, and instead of getting those S13 rotors and pads, I ended up getting Q45 everything. And the reason why is because this is a pretty big car. I don't need 4-piston calipers on this thing, but the Q45 on an S chassis is like an OEM upgrade. This is only the caliper brackets, but look at the size difference of these two. Alright, let's get these brakes put on so we can wrap this up. make sure you put on the correct caliper. Some aren't marked, but this one is. It has an L right here for the left side of the car. The easiest way to tell is the bleeder valve will always go up when you install it, because this is going to be one of the highest points to bleed the air out of the system. And the last thing is the outer tie rod. Okay, and that's it. We now have S13 suspension on this Mark II, and look at the angle that we have. God damn. Oh man, that's a little much. I'm gonna mess with the bump stops over here because that's a little bit too much angle, and I don't want the rack to get overworked and get completely cooked, since this is a brand new rack. And this is I know I could probably get this rack rebuilt, but worst case scenario, if I can get it rebuilt, it is a 180SX rack, and I would have to go back to Japan or pay a lot of money to find one online again and have it shipped. So I want to protect this rack as much as I can. I still have to put on the brake hose, but I will do that on my own time because I'm still working on the ABS delete. But for those who are looking to do this on their X8, this is as far as you need to go. I still need to get an alignment, obviously, but I'm hoping that there's no problems, that there's no binding. I think binding is my #1 issue with this whole conversion. And like I said, the way I put the lower control arm is I left it free floating, and then I worked around it, meaning I put on the tension rod and had the tension rod come up to the lower control arm instead of pulling it forward or backwards. The heim joint isn't completely straight, and that's because the tension rod is actually supposed to go inward a little bit like this from the front. But because of where the existing holes on the X8 and the existing holes on the S13 tension rod bracket was, this is where I put it. And if I'm gonna have any problems, I feel like this is where the problem is gonna be. All of this is still going to be trial and error. I've actually had some people reach out to me on Instagram and tell me that they've done this same conversion on their X8s, but they didn't get into specifications of where they put their setups. But this is my attempt at this conversion, and if I run into any problems, I will be 100% transparent with you guys and let you guys know what happened, what I did wrong, and what maybe I did to try to fix it, because I would love to see more X8s driving. And there's not many of us out there, but if something like this can make your car feel more enjoyable, then that's awesome. Now, one thing to note, if you are only looking to do suspension, meaning the lower control arm, knuckle, and the tension rod, you are perfectly okay without having to change out the rack and the tie rods. The stock X8 one should work fine. I know that moving over to an X7 rack is a common thing to do for X8s, but you do not have to do S13 rack conversion also. I just did it because you know what, I have an S13, so that way I have parts that I can share with both cars. Now, even with all this, the X8 chassis has been left completely alone, I guess minus the subframe, but some frame is attached. But the chassis, the holes for the tension rod bracket, the factory ones are still there. Same goes for the ones on the lower radiator support, my lower control arms. The S13 ones are a little bit bigger. I want to say maybe like 2 to 3 millimeters. I had to use a jack to get them fit up in there. But if I ever needed to move over to an X8 lower control arm, I could. I didn't mess with the subframe part too much. All the drilling and cutting was done on the S13 parts, the lower control arm and the tension rod bracket, so the chassis is untouched. But that's it. It actually took me quite a while to put this video together because there were some parts that I was missing that I had to order and took a while to get here, like the rotors, the pads, calipers, what else did I forget? The tie rod boots, hardware, stuff like that. But going back to the beginning of the video where I said that I needed to get this thing on the ground and moving, and that is because I am driving a event in NorCal at the end of April, beginning of February, called Recollection Auto Fashion, and I need this space, this workspace, to paint my aero and do some finishing touches on the car, mainly aero work. I don't have anywhere else to paint besides right here, so I needed to get this thing moved out and under a cover. I still won't be driving this thing anytime soon because all my focus is going to be on that. But it's February 5th at the time of this recording, and I have about 3 weeks until we take off to NorCal, to Thunder Hill. Thunder Hill Raceway is where it's being held at. A little bit about the event. Recollection Auto Fashion, or well, RAF for short. It's a styled event that's hosted by the guys from Aimless and Uprise, and they kind of strive, and everybody that's going to that event is striving to make the car look as pretty and immaculate as they can. And I'm stoked about that because I'm a big fan of styled events. I love seeing nice cars driving low cars, handsome name, channel name. Yeah, that's what I am gonna focus all my time and effort and money into getting done. So this thing is gonna take a back seat for now. I'm gonna get it on the floor and pushed out of the way so I can get to work on the fenders. My front rear bumpers and both my front fenders, they were just repaired by John and Astrid from Moonlight Runners. I'm not that good at fiberglass just yet, and I'm too busy with work, and I get home late and I get off late, so I had them do it and they did a great job. So I might be doing a video on painting that stuff and maybe making the splitter. I'm not sure yet. It depends on how much time I have because I'm kind of on a time crunch right now. Oh, and I also have new wheels for the 240. I don't know if they're going to be done in time. I had new barrels, lips, and the face was chromed. If you watched any of my previous videos, you might know what they are. If not, then don't worry about it. You'll see them when they're on there. No big deal. But that's going to be it for now. I apologize to the XA owners who wanted to see a little bit more of this thing, but for now it has to take the back seat, and that's the problem with having two cars. Sometimes you gotta prioritize one over the other, and right now the 240 is priority number one. I gotta get that thing looking as perfect as I can, so it might be a while until this thing gets another video. But if you guys stick around until then, I would appreciate that, and look forward until then. And if you guys made it this far, and if this video is helpful at all in any way, that's awesome. That's why I'm doing it. It honestly takes a really long time to record and work on the car at the same time. But if all this helps even just one person, then I'm stoked with that. I'm happy with that because I really like getting helpful information out. So don't ever be afraid to reach out, comment if you have any questions. If you have any criticism, I'm okay with that. I'm not gonna get butthurt. I'm still new to this, I'm still learning, but if you guys have made it this far, I really appreciate you guys watching to the very end, and I will see you on the next one.